This week we are going to be shifting gears a little bit. Over the last few weeks we've been dealing with CSS, HTML, and some jQuery, and how we can actually use that to make websites a bit more dynamic and interactive. Well, this week we're going to shift over to what is referred to as a server-side scripting language called PHP. Some of you may be familiar with it, others maybe not so much, but it's a pretty robust and powerful language, and it runs in the background of some pretty big sites. One you may have heard of is called Facebook. Another is WordPress, and so those are just a couple of examples, and we are going to start learning some of the basics of PHP over the next few weeks. So this video is just an introduction. So the first question we ask is, well, why do we care, or why do we need PHP? Why do we want to use it? Well, one of the reasons is we can avoid outdated content on our website because PHP makes it possible to interact with, in fact, it was designed to interact with databases, and therefore it can serve up new data as soon as it's available and is triggered to do so. Likewise, it can serve up custom content to your visitors. Using Facebook as an example, of course, there's a massive database behind that stores all of your information, and it's PHP that is running the commands that comes up to personalize your experience. PHP allows you to easily and rapidly change your content without having to touch the code of your website, and it creates an archive of sorts. So I mentioned in the introduction here that we've been dealing with what is referred to as client-side scripts, and we are going to be moving on to what's called server-side. So first of all, we kind of need to understand what on earth this means. So client-side is exactly that. It means it runs on the visitor's workstation after it downloads the web page. So it runs on your computer within your browser to render up a page. JavaScript and also jQuery are the most popular, and both of them are embedded directly in the HTML web page or linked to external files, similar to CSS, which we've had experience doing now. We've in both the jQuery exercise as well as in the most recent Bootstrap exercise, you have had experience linking to an external jQuery or JavaScript file. And client-side languages also tend to generate the elements that HTML itself cannot. Granted, some of that is now being replaced with CSS, but still, those are CSS, HTML, JavaScript, jQuery are all client-side applications. So for example, we can use jQuery or JavaScript to create pop-up messages or dialog boxes. So if you go to a website that requires a login, and it might just actually pop it up in a new window, that might be taken care of using something like jQuery or JavaScript. There is a big downside because client-side can offer a lot of really great features and functionality. It adds a ton of interactivity, and so therefore makes feel like a very dynamic site. But the downside is we as developers are at the mercy of the client's web browser. We don't know how up to date it is. We don't know which browser they're using. We don't know anything about their computer, the memory, if they have any extensions, plugins, or anything else installed. So we have no idea how exactly that page is going to render. So all of this stuff is taking place within the browser. And the easiest way you can tell that is if you go to a website that you suspect is using JavaScript, you can right-click on it and do a view source, and you're either going to see the JavaScript right in the page, or you're going to see a link, just like our CSS files, out to a JavaScript, and you can look at all of that scripting. So here's a brief little model that's going to demonstrate how client-side scripting works. The first thing is, as a user sitting at the computer, you're actually sending a page request off to the HTTP or web server. Once it's there, it sends back the information, and if there happens to be any JavaScript on it, JavaScript processes the script locally on the user's computer, and therefore then the final web page is loaded. So you can see there's not a whole lot to this, and the majority of the work is actually being done right at the user's computer. We are aware that HTML operates with standards. We're currently on HTML5. CSS operates with standards. We're at CSS3. Unfortunately, web scripting languages such as JavaScript do not. This means that web pages may work just fine for one type of browser or even one version of a browser, but not at all in another. So this inconsistency is problematic for those of us who are trying to develop web pages and generate a continuous experience across any device. This is particularly true now that we've moved into the mobile world, so the more we can take care of this in a server-side scripting language, the more consistent the experience. That's when server-side scripting languages step in. Some of their benefits is they run on the web server. So they run out on the HTTP server or possibly a scripting server before it is even returned to the visitor who requested the page. The web server then, in part, takes the HTML that the scripting code generates and inserts it directly into the web page being sent. This is why if and when you start doing some of our coding exercises this week, if you right-click on them and do a view source, you're only going to see the HTML. It's because on the server side, our web server has already parsed and interpreted the PHP commands and then sends back only HTML. In this case, this is why we like server-side languages. They do all of the work for us right on the server, and so therefore you're guaranteed a consistent experience because every one of your own web pages is being served up through your server. There's going to be a consistency in what happens. So just like we had the diagram of the client-side scripting, you'll see here that when we're using a scripting language like PHP that's server-side, there's a bit more to it. So the first step is the same. The end user or the client makes a page request, and that goes out to the web server. Once it goes out to the web server, if PHP is installed, there will be a plugin and it will translate that script contained within the web page so that it can send it back as HTML. In the meanwhile, because one of the things that PHP is really good at and was partially designed to do is to speak directly to database servers like MySQL, the other thing it can do is while it's translating what the PHP wants, it can go and retrieve or upload any information to the MySQL server or from the MySQL server. So if you're creating, say, a login, or you already have a login and you're typing in your username and password, that PHP code is going to contain that information and it's going to check it on the MySQL server that it's related to, and it's going to see it and it's going to verify it, and if it does, then it's going to send it back to the client. And in this case, the content may be different for every user. It might be customized, which is great when you've got, like, say, an e-commerce account, and it'll send it back to you. So for example, when I'm in Amazon, at the top, it says, "Hello, Chris." That's part of my experience. And in addition, it serves up books and products that are ones that I might have looked at recently, ones that I may have purchased, and therefore there are requests. So this is what PHP is allowing to have happen. So now that you understand the difference between a client-side scripting language and a server-side, let's just kind of dig back into the history and see what exactly PHP is. PHP is what is referred to as a recursive acronym, because PHP itself actually stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. So what it's doing, if we look at the last couple words there, Hypertext Preprocessor, what it's doing is it's going through the script and it's pre-processing it before it sends it back to the client. It is the most widely used server-side scripting language, and it is open source, which is also one of the reasons it is most widely used. This number is a little bit old, but I think you still get the idea. As of January 2013, PHP was installed on more than 240 million websites, and I'm sure that number has gone up tremendously in the 3 to 4 years since this number was generated, and is on 2.1 million web servers. Those are crazy numbers. The other thing is it's easily embedded into HTML, as we are going to find out because that's what we're going to be doing. It can be used on all major operating systems, so Mac, Windows, and Linux all can run PHP, and it supports a wide range of databases. It's most commonly used with SQL or MySQL, which is when you might hear the term LAMP. Let's see, there's LAMP, MAMP, WAMP, and XAMPP. So what does that mean? Well, there is what's called a web development stack. In the case of, let's start with LAMP, because that was always the most commonly heard. L stands for Linux. So it's using a Linux operating system. It's using an Apache web server. It is then using M is MySQL, and P is the PHP. So this is all, the Apache, MySQL, and PHP are all open source. So if you know that LAMP means Linux, MAMP is Macintosh, WAMP is Windows, and XAMPP is a newer variation, and it means that it can be installed and it works with all three of the major operating systems. PHP was created only 3 years after HTML was created by a gentleman named Rasmus Lerdorf. He is originally from Greenland and currently holds Canadian citizenship. And after he's been through a number of career changes, and currently he is working at Etsy. I think it would be absolutely amazing to say that I'm at a company that requires a large database, and you actually have the inventor of PHP, which was designed to work with databases. PHP was actually discovered kind of accidentally. Rasmus wrote what was, at that time, it was really common, called CGI, which was Common Gateway Interface. Basically, he just wanted to do something that actually kept track of his home files, like his personal files, and organize them in such a way. And so that's where it started. It was completely unintentional. And then he ended up working with some friends who were like, you know, this could really be used for some bigger purposes. And so he worked on it to extend its ability to work with web forms, which is one of the most common ways that you are adding information or logging into something, and it communicates with databases. That is where the power of PHP really comes from. So in its early days, PHP stood for Personal Homepage, because that's what he had used to develop this, was to come up with this personal homepage that would give him organization and organize his info, and he could just script it and it would pull all this information in. It is since, going back here, has become just shortened because it's not for homepage or personal files anymore, so it's just become PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. It was developed completely organically, and it was not a planned development out of any particular necessity or need. So what you need then, if you're looking for a web hosting situation that can run PHP, well, fortunately, it's pretty easy to find. Almost every major web host out there has a PHP scripting server, scripting application that runs on the web server. So what we need to do is we need an operating system that supports PHP. Going back to that stack, that LAMP stack. So most web servers are going to be Linux-based, which is what Apache servers are, or Windows-based, and either of them supports PHP programs. Then you also need to have the web server itself that can run PHP embedded scripts in the web page. So this means it has PHP, the PHP application running on that server so that it can parse out those scripts. And you need a database server that the PHP code can access. I mean, that's only if you're going to be running databases, but the majority of the time that you're going to be using PHP is to access databases. That's where its power really comes in. And again, it works with a really wide array of databases, the most common being SQL and MySQL. So our current web server here that we are using for class is through GoDaddy. It happens to be one that's running on an Apache web server, which is the most popular web server platform on the internet. And part of the reason is because it's incredibly stable. It's open source, so it's also very inexpensive and easy to maintain. On our server, we also have MySQL database, which in a few weeks we will be using and setting up. And that also comes with PHP MyAdmin. And we're actually going to be using another tool in this case that will connect with MySQL, but it's also written in PHP as an interface that's intended to handle the administration of MySQL. So let's take a look at our first script. I highly encourage you, if you choose to just write down this little script, type it up, and save it as a PHP document, and then run it on your website. And you will not be able to, just as a reminder, you will not be able to preview this on your local computer because it's a server-side script, meaning everything that we just talked about in this video, that it's going to need to have that PHP scripting server to translate it. So you can't just run it locally. But you can see that the majority of this is just in HTML. When we open up a PHP file and actually run the PHP, we start it with the little left-facing angled bracket, a question mark, and the letters PHP. On the other end of it, we close it with just the question mark and the little right-facing angled bracket. In this particular case, we're using a command called echo, which simply means display what follows on the screen. And in this case, we're just going to be displaying some text. And so it's contained within quotation marks, and there's a semicolon at the end. You're going to get more familiar with this as we move through the next few weeks. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more background, and you're ready to move on to the next videos that will introduce you to things like variables, strings, numeric strings, arrays, and operators.